Ready whenever you are, Sam.
We'll open the city council work session. We need an approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Yes.
This is a public or a regular kind of work session, so we do ask for public comment. I have nobody listed online, but anybody in the house wish to make a public comment? Okay, we'll move straight to our discussion items. Bruce, you want to get us started?
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind if I just take a minute, I want to read kind of a preamble to this meeting. All right. I was hoping more people would be able to hear, but the city acquired the former Cannon Beach Elementary School property on July 1st, 2020. In the beginning, it was the city's philosophy that the primary purpose for moving forward with the purchase was to acquire the land, which is prominently located at the entrance to the city, adjoins other city property, and sits on Ecola Creek. The condition of the 70-year-old wooden buildings seemed questionable, but the thought was that if the land could be bought or brought under city control and we could ultimately get use of the buildings, it would be a double win for our community. Staff approached O'Brien Construction for guidance on how to get the more detailed information on the conditions of the buildings and the potential cost of renovations. They suggested me what we might want to work with ZCS Engineering, as they have extensive experience in working with school buildings throughout the state. ZCS has prepared a preliminary report and cost estimate that is essentially split into categories of 1, what it will take to stop the deterioration of what is there. 2, what it will take to bring the 70-year-old structures up to code. 3, what it will cost to get the building into shape to operate as a viable community center. And 4, the work and cost to develop a high-functioning building. These categories were selected to indicate the cost of various levels of improvements. There are a myriad of ways that the construction of the project can be undertaken, and each of those will result in a different phasing scheme. So the way that it's written is that the cost of stopping the deterioration is estimated at $23,000. Although Karen and I found out just prior to the meeting, it's probably going to be another $100,000 because that's what it'll cost for the roof. And we are having some significant leaks, but that's a kind of stop the damage figure. And then also there's the cost of the high functioning facility, or category 4, which is high. It's at $3.998 million. I'm saying this should not be a shock considering the age of the buildings, the construction material, which is wood, and their lack of maintenance probably for 1 or 2 decades. What we are going to be presented is a very preliminary estimate and will be subject to change up or down depending on our final decisions. Later on, after the presentation from ZCS, we will be talking about possible ways to pay for the project. This is a very preliminary discussion. So far, the costs incurred for the purchase have come from the tourism lodging tax funds the city receives from the county as reimbursement for what Cannon Beach collects towards the county jail operations tax. I'm going to read this. I was kind of tongue in cheek as I was writing it. I'm pleased to announce that in a country that is not used to hearing it, there is good news. In all this. The second discussion will show that it is possible, if we want to use the county TLT funds, I'm not saying that we would, but it is possible that we would be able to do a loan and pay the debt service on a $4 million loan with only a portion of what we receive from the county. In other words, it could be possible to take the loan to undertake the entire project without cost to our taxpayers or taking away from current programs. And it might even be possible there could still be funds left over for operations. That is just one option. There are other decisions and other directions that we could go. But just when you're looking at almost a $4 million cost, I want to say that is something that we can do without losing anything or without increasing the cost to taxpayers. There's all kinds of other levels where we could do less. There are many other funding options that are possible. No decisions have been made yet. There will be subsequent discussions of what we could do if we had such a facility, different ways it could be built, and different ways it could be paid for. The message here is that the discussion we're about to have and the dollar amounts that will be shared, in my mind, should not deter us from considering what could be. It's my little speech, sir. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Matt. And Matt, your last name, I'm sorry.
Crawford.
Matt Crawford.
Yep.
He's with ZCS, and we also have Zach. He's on here also. And they're kind of it's an engineer architect team, isn't it?
Yep, we are engineer architect team. So my name is Matthew Crawford. I do architectural design for ZCS, and I helped with the report. Zach was planning on being here tonight, but he wasn't feeling great, so he decided to call in instead. But we'll have a PowerPoint presentation we'll go over, and I'll let Zach take over. I'll get that pulled up.
Good evening. Sorry, I muted myself because I needed to sneeze and I didn't want to interrupt Bruce. I really apologize for not being there. My preference is to be in person, but I didn't want to bring my sinus infection and whatever I've got going on into your group. So we opted to have me stay home and do this remotely. Luckily, we're in an age when technology allows us to do so. Thanks for the introduction. My name is Zach Stokes. I work for ZCS Engineering. I'm a principal in the firm, and I help run our Oregon City office. I'm a Klamath Falls native, grew up in Southern Oregon in small towns, Medford, Klamath Falls, and have ended up in Oregon City mainly because of work. Our firm's based in Klamath Falls, and I started working there when I was in college. We do seismic retrofits of elementary schools, high schools, really all educational facilities all over the state. That's not all of our work, but we do a lot of it. And we've been doing it for, 10 or 12 years now, pretty consistently at quite a few projects per year, especially for the last 5 years. A lot of that work has been on the North Coast, Central Coast, and South Coast. And most of our work on the North Coast has been with O'Brien Construction. We've been working with Keeley and his team since 2012 when we worked on the fire station Garibaldi, and we're just completing projects with them at Nestucca Valley School District. So we do a lot of work with that group and have a good level of comfort. They understand our seismic retrofit methodologies, and they're the ones that put us in touch with Karen and Bruce. So it's a little bit of background with respect to our relationship, how we got connected with the city. We work primarily in rural America, I said rural Oregon, with a lot of school districts and not so much in the metro area, despite having an office location there. It's a demand of the talent base where we can find engineers and architects like Matthew that's there with you tonight. We provide civil, structural, and architecture, civil engineering and structural engineering and architecture. So we were able to kind of look at your facility as a whole internally without having a whole bunch of additional costs from sub-consultants out of house. That's how we handle most of our seismic retrofits also. And really looking at Cannon Beach Elementary is something that is really consistent with the work that we do regularly. We're regularly going into buildings that were built anywhere. I was in a 1940s building today, anywhere from the late 1800s through the 1940s and then all the way up into current buildings and new construction. Your building is in relatively good shape. I would say there are problems that everybody knows about, leaky roofs, windows that have been broken over time, but just kind of as an overall comment from an engineer that sees a lot of buildings and a lot of different shapes of disrepair, I think the bones of your building are pretty good. I think you've got a good starting place. And I think that the gymnasium is unlike anything else I've seen in the state of Oregon. And I've seen a lot of gymnasiums. It's really neat. And I would say it's a really exciting thing that the city has decided to purchase the building and retain the gymnasium, hopefully, and continue it into the future. It's a neat specimen of architecture of that time. Matthew, are you following with me with this PowerPoint presentation? I can't really see where we're at. I don't know if everybody has it in front of them.
We can't look at you and there we go. Okay.
Okay.
That'll work.
So introductions. Okay, here we go.
Keep going. Next one. Okay, so here's a couple of recent seismic retrofit projects that we've done with O'Brien, Nehalem Elementary, Liberty Elementary in Tillamook, East Elementary in Tillamook. We worked in Garibaldi and in Cloverdale with the Nestucca School District. So here, the gymnasium that we've got pictured is the Liberty Elementary Gymnasium in Tillamook. Before we were able to remove the ceiling, put some uplights into the roof structure, get it all cleaned up, it was pretty old, pretty dingy, and not really a pleasant place to be. That's one project that we're really proud of our coordination that we were able to do with O'Brien and Company. Matthew, you want to go to the next slide? So when we were hired on to do an evaluation of your building, it kind of meant a lot of things. And it was a little bit of an evolving scope, if you will, because initially we started talking about a seismic retrofit, but in reality, what we needed to understand is enough information to get the city a really good feel for what construction costs would be to turn Cannon Beach Elementary into really a community center from what we understand, and everything in between. So this is not a report that was generated on lots of involvement with the community. It's not a report that had a lot of destructive investigation going into it. We didn't open up holes in the walls. We didn't cut open the roof. We went in and we looked at the structure that we could see, and we had conversations with city staff with respect to what the city's thoughts and goals might be surrounding the building, and developed kind of some starting place for the city to begin this conversation. What could this project look like, and what could the costs associated with it look like? They're very, very rough. We have not done design. We have not prepared construction documents. So we're really going off of our knowledge of what a seismic retrofit costs, what typical remodel costs are, working with O'Brien and talking about cost per square foot, so that we can help give you an idea of different levels of effort associated with bringing this building back online, or just maintaining it the way it is. I want to pause there for a second. I've been talking a lot. Does anybody have any questions with respect to what I've said so far? Is there any comment throughout all of this? If anybody wants to speak up, please say so. I prefer an interactive presentation rather than something where I just sit and talk at you.
I don't see anybody yet, but I'm sure there will be. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sorry I didn't say that sooner. So our report is outlined the way that we did our investigation. It has some background. It goes into our visual inspection. We walked the building. We went through and we evaluated the buildings for seismic concerns. That was based on standard evaluation techniques through ASCE 4117 that dictates how we evaluate and retrofit buildings for seismic concerns. We separated those deficiencies by the main building, by the gymnasium, and then we gave you some recommendations with respect to the things that we would do to fix those. We also looked at the architectural code issues. Are there enough restrooms? Are the restrooms ADA accessible? What are we going to have to do to get a certificate of occupancy? Do we need heat? What do the systems of the building look like? And then we started looking at architectural deficiencies. There's a hole in the siding here and there. The windows are broken. We're not up to code with respect to ADA. We kind of culminated all of that information, gathered it up, and put it into our best stab at a cost estimate. We've been through maybe 3 or 4 iterations of that cost estimate, going back and forth with staff to make sure that we have a document that everybody feels is going to be valuable to the city. As it was mentioned earlier, we've broken it down into 4 different sections so that it's easily digestible. One key item with respect to the breakdown is we want to make sure that we're not doing something in level 1 that's going to have to be redone in level 2 or level 3 if the city decides to move on. So we took some time to make sure that as best as we could, we didn't overlap between 2 phases. That's why some phases are larger than others. And it really helped us to define what a potential scope of work and project flow could be. Any questions on that before I turn it over to Matthew and we get into kind of a step-by-step of the deficiencies that we saw, what is included in each of the levels and why? We're not going to walk through it line by line unless that's requested, but really want to give you an overall feel for what we saw in the building.
Okay, so like we've mentioned, we broke the cost estimate down into 4 different levels, with the scope of work kind of getting more substantial as we go through each level. Each level kind of has it broken down within itself to the gymnasium and the main building. We've broken it into the levels to kind of give the city options for selecting the level of effort or the amount of money that they want to contribute. The levels range from minor exterior repairs in level 1 to a model community center in level 4. And each level has the cost of the preceding level included within it. So the idea is that you can't do a level 3 without first doing the work that was required in level 1 and level 2. And like Zach mentioned, we did take into account any duplicate costs from the hard costs or the soft costs and subtracted those from the totals from each level. So you can just pick, the city can look at each level and pick whichever one they would like to do. So the first level is stop deterioration. We know the building has been vacant for 9 years. It's pretty obvious there was a lot of water damage throughout the building. The roof obviously has exceeded its lifespan. And so that's kind of the biggest issue that we've noticed throughout the building was the level of water damage throughout that. So level 1 is just focused around stopping that deterioration. So going and fixing the siding, the holes that we can see in the building, fixing the broken windows, and patching the roof. And these are all kind of temporary fixes just to get you down the road. So we see level 1 as kind of a reoccurring theme. Level 2 is obtaining occupancy. So this is referring to getting a certification of occupancy from the building official. So level 2 costs would be the items that would be required by code in order to reoccupy the building. And when we did this code report, we did talk to the building official about it. And his major concern was kind of the lack of maintenance or the deferred maintenance that was happening since the building has been vacant. Another big item with obtaining occupancy is changing the occupancy classification. Since we are wanting to use the building as a community center, it was currently or previously a school, so we'd have to change the occupancy. That can trigger a lot of code upgrades. Fortunately, the gymnasium has been used as an assembly space throughout its lifespan, which is kind of what we're proposing as a community center. So we don't have to change the occupancy of the gymnasium. The classroom wing, on the other hand, is changing from education to a business occupancy. We're allowed to call it a business occupancy since it will be used for adult education and training purposes. But it's not what they call a relatively higher hazard when you're changing it from a business to an education. So it doesn't trigger a lot of those upgrades. However, it does require a firewall be constructed between the main building and the gymnasium. So level 2 includes costs for creating a fire barrier, 2-hour fire barrier that separates the gym and the main building. And that basically involves replacing the doors along that breezeway to be fire rated, redoing the exterior finish to make it a 2-hour rating. Some other items that would be required are installing a heating system in the main building that had been taken out at some point. So we'd have to put a new heating system in, repairing some of the water damage, that we see in the classrooms. Some miscellaneous electrical items, possibly just so the lights are all functioning and everything is working. And then there's ADA upgrades that are also required per code. So you have to spend 25% of your construction cost towards ADA upgrades. So those would be things like having accessible parking and accessible restrooms, for example. But level 2 is
Hey,
really
Matthew, can I jump in?
Yeah.
So level 2, I think that this is where Matthew was going before I jumped in. Level 2 is an improvement to the facility, but not such an improvement that it really looks all that different than it does today. Right. It gets us a warm and dry environment that's safe. It doesn't get us new flooring. There might still be some finishes that are from the 70s. It's going to kind of look like it does today, but we're going to be able to hold a meeting in there because it's warm and there's not water dripping at our head. We're not going to have broken glass, and all the doors are going to be able to open. It takes away that chunk of there hasn't been any maintenance done, and we're not just stopping the deterioration, but we're bringing it up to an occupiable state today. One thing that is not included in level 2 that's worth noting is a seismic retrofit. This goes back to Matthew's comments about increasing the relative hazard category for the space, and the fact that we're not doing that by moving it from an educational use to a business use. So at stage 2, a seismic retrofit is not required as a scope of work item. That's not to say that there aren't seismic concerns with the building and that they couldn't be included in a lower level if the city wanted to. In addition to the kind of the high spots that Matthew hit with respect to the fire separation, the ADA stuff, the leaky roof, all of those items, there are seismic deficiencies in the building. They're not seismic deficiencies that are so far out of whack with other construction from this time period that I'd be losing sleep over it. We see buildings like this all the time that haven't been seismically retrofit. That being said, there's deficiencies. The building's stable right now, but in an earthquake, I want to be somewhere else. I think that that's probably the best way that I can put it. If we talk for a second about seismic deficiencies in general, the fact that there's a lot of glazing on the street side of the classroom wing is a negative. We'd want to fix that with some structure, either some new walls or some moment frames. The gymnasium has actually a pretty good structure. We'd need to do some work to the end walls, put some plywood shear walls there. There'd probably be some foundation work, and we'd want to put a new roof on it to make sure that we've got plywood that's really nailed off and connected down to the foundation at the bottom of the arch and connected to those end walls. So the seismic retrofit component of this, it is kind of substantial. It lives in level 3 if we're going to do major improvements to the facility. I just didn't want to move on from level 2 before you guys understood that seismic's not in there, but we did look at it. There are deficiencies, kind of give you an idea what those deficiencies are before we move to level 3. Any questions about that component or any of the components we've touched on so far?
At what level or at what point do we require sprinklers, fire suppression?
That's included in level 3.
But is it required or is it recommended?
With the level of improvements in level 3, I think it probably would be required. We initially did our code study. We weren't anticipating major improvements. It's not required just to occupy the building. But if you trigger, sprinklers are triggered once you kind of get to a certain threshold of improvements. So I think it would be required in a level 3 improvement, a full remodel of the building.
The way I read that was only for the gym, not for the classrooms, correct?
You are correct, right? Because we have that fire separation between the two occupancies, so it would just be in the gym.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, level 3 is a tenant improvement project. So it's a remodel of the whole building. So going through replacing all the finishes, all the windows, all the doors, lighting, seismic retrofit, sprinklers, fire alarms. We have a line item for rebuilding the mezzanine in the gymnasium, new restrooms throughout, and some minor space reconfiguration in the nurse office area in the main building.
We should, like Mike said, we should be considering the sprinkler system as a required per code.
Yes, at some point. Yeah, in level 3, I mean, we're saying it would be required for level 3, I assume. I mean, just to get an occupancy, it's not right now. But in level 3.
Put a use where you're inviting the public in for conferences and classes. I guess not only the use, but the level of activity, does that have an impact on whether we put in sprinklers or seismic?
Well, it comes back to that relative hazard. When you're changing the occupancy from education to assembly, it's a higher hazard. But when you're changing it from education to business, it's not a higher hazard. So that doesn't necessarily trigger the sprinklers.
What I'd like to jump in for a second, Matthew. When we look at existing buildings, we get a little bit of credit because they were built under the code of the day. And we really have to comply with that code until we cross certain thresholds with respect to improvements, like Matthew said. So when we get into a really big, let's call it a $3 million tenant improvement project where we're moving walls and doing stuff, we're going to want to bring that up to current code level. If we're just occupying it, it's not a requirement. To meet current code, it would be required, but it's not a requirement at that level because you're being given credit for the fact that the building's effectively grandfathered in. What we see with a lot of clients in a situation like this is they say, I'm a school district or I'm a city and I want to be a leader in my community. Everybody that builds a new building has to put in sprinkler systems. I want to do it at maybe the earlier stage rather than when I have to, because I want to be a great example to my community. That's not always the case. Sometimes monetarily that just doesn't work, and we only do upgrades like this when it's required at that phase. So we've included it where it's required, but I would say if there's budget available, say in level 2, if this is a phased approach, I think that would be a wonderful addition to level 2 because it really does improve the safety of the facility. It's a wood structure. It is flammable. You are hopefully going to have a lot of people in there. I think that would be a good move. Does that help answer your question?
It does for me, but are your comments also valid on our decision to do the seismic retrofit?
Those comments are exactly valid. Yeah. A seismic upgrade actually probably wouldn't be required through this project unless we really get into some exterior wall stuff. But because we're not increasing that relative hazard category, it's all going to be voluntary seismic upgrades. In our conversations with city staff, it sounded like there was certainly value in the gymnasium being strong during an earthquake and having the ability to be a shelter and community gathering place post-event. So we've included that in level 3, but very similar to the fire sprinklers, that's what we would call voluntary seismic upgrades. You don't have to, but you're doing it in order to make sure that you're being an example and make sure you're providing a safe space for community people to gather in.
Thank you.
Yep. Let me then get ahead of you a little bit. Say a new roof on the gymnasium aspect. If we replace a new roof, we then are upgrading the insulation, and at that point, the seismic aspect is just a good idea.
You're right, for sure. A seismic retrofit almost every time involves replacing the roof because you have to re-nail the roof sheathing or replace it. So right now you guys you have a quote for $100,000 to replace the roof. But yet if you do a seismic retrofit, there's a possibility, that you would have to do that again. There is always the potential to come at the roof from the underside, so you don't have to take the roof off. But normally we try and, most time buildings need new roofs, and so that's where we go at it. We have.
In the case of the I want to add to that real quick, Matthew. In the case of the gymnasium, we would not want to come in and do a seismic retrofit from underneath, because it would probably involve putting plywood sheathing and on the inside of that barrel roof and covering up all the cool arched glue lambs that are there. I think that adds a lot of character to the building, and we wouldn't want to get that covered up. So we would want to do a seismic retrofit, or at least a partial seismic retrofit on the top of the roof at the time of the roof replacement.
Yeah. And you can do, anticipating a seismic retrofit, if you want to do the roof first, you can go in and just re-nail the diaphragm, without doing a full seismic retrofit when you do the roof replacement.
And that's in the roof that we're talking about is the one over the classrooms. We're not really having a roof leak problem in the gym, correct, Karen? It's, we have walls we can see through. And there have been leaks on the floor and things like that, but the classroom is the one that's really impacting us right now.
That's for level 1. Just to.
Level 1 is just repair it. Level,
Yeah, and
whatever, wherever it is, the total replacement of the classroom roof is a different topic.
Yeah, we had that in level 3. And so we did have $100,000 to replace the roof in level 3, but it's,
yeah, but let me tell you where we are. We have a real bad leak over the area that used to be the administration area. And so, we're looking at doing some kind of a repair or something there, but we're also having leaks in other locations. And so we said, what's a price for being able to do the whole roof? And we were told it was around 95,000 or 100,000. We need to have a subsequent conversation with Zach and Matt to find out what would the design of a new roof, deck be, all that. So that if somebody comes in advance, could we accomplish what we needed to do so we didn't have to do it a second time?
So we do the retrofit or seismic.
Yeah, if we're going to do a roof, and again, there's a lot of decisions have to be made, like, are we going to use the classrooms? If we are, then it makes sense that if we're going to do, that kind of a repair and we're having problems elsewhere, instead of keep chasing it, do the roof. So we're taking care of waterproofing. But if we're going to do that, do it in a way that's going to support the retrofit so we don't have to come back later. So there's a lot of, we got a moving target over there. It's been sitting there for 7 years, but now it's moving, so.
And for all of the conversations that we have about this property, be very clear about which building you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because there's different decisions made for the classroom compared to the gymnasium.
So are we talking about a replacement for the roof in the gymnasium as well as the classrooms? Didn't sound like it.
we have that in our cost estimate to do both roofs. Yeah,
What level would that be? Would that be 2 or 3?
that's in level 3. Level 2 was just kind of the most minimal that we could do to get a certification of occupancy. So it would include patching it, but not necessarily a replacement.
Is it true that for the gym, part of the roofing is related to the seismic retrofit more than leak or anything? Did I understand that correctly?
Say that again, I'm not.
That the seismic retrofit, that the roof on the gym, the reason for saying that's coming up is that in order to achieve any kind of a seismic retrofit, we're going to have to do different things with the construction than what was done previously.
Yes, correct. We have to get at the roof to do the seismic retrofit. So we would have to replace the roofing in order to do that.
That'd all be from the outside, not from inside.
Correct. Okay, sorry, Matt. Go ahead and continue with your presentation.
Okay. That's most of it. So we have level 3 at 3.7 million. And then level 4 is just kind of the next step up from level 3. So level 3 gets you a nice, medium grade functioning community center. Level 4 kind of steps it up another notch to a model community center. So it just involves kind of upgrading the finishes throughout the building and bringing it up to a nice community center that you can be proud of and show off. And
In my mind, I think being a musician, that the difference between 3 and 4 is like a sound system. In 3, you could announce a basketball game, but in 4, you could play music for an event. That's the kind of difference I think that we would see.
Mhm.
Carpet versus a wood floor.
Correct. Yeah. Like for the gymnasium example, it would be a hardwood floor versus say a VCT or a rubber flooring, something of that nature.
Now, Matt, can you dive into the abatement discussion a little bit? Of
Sure.
Materials, and why that is in level 3 and not level 2?
So we typically just do hazardous materials abatement when we're affecting or impacting that area. So there is some abatement, built into level 2 where there's water damage, for example, on a floor and you have to fix it. Most of the flooring throughout there is the 9x9 tile, which we know is asbestos. So there's some amount of abatement in level 2 for just fixing those little areas. Level 3, we're doing a full floor replacement. So we're going in and abating, the entire floor. And the mastic on the walls holding up the chalkboards. And if there's any ceiling, popcorn ceilings, for example, that sort of thing. But in level 3, we're kind of touching everything. So we're going to have to do abatement throughout the building.
But for level 2, it's not a requirement,
No.
just repairing the spots that need it.
Correct.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it's I don't know, Zach, if you know, but I've never really seen it as a requirement to do hazardous materials abatement. I mean, unless you're obviously affecting the area, but to just abate things on their own.
Yeah, when we get into hazardous materials, most of the time, if we look at 9x9 floor tiles that are asbestos containing material, unless they're chipping up from the ground or they're damaged, it's not a hazard until it's removed or until it's altered or until it's damaged. So it's sitting there. I walked into 2 schools today that have 1960s and 1970s asbestos floor tiles. They're there, they're fine. Where we get into trouble is when we really start touching them, getting in, demolishing things. Those asbestos particles can get into the air and then into people's lungs. So in level 2, we're not really touching enough of those surfaces to have big line items for that work. But in level 3, when we go through and we replace floors and ceilings and pull things off of walls and do a major tenant improvement, that's when we opted to include the hazardous materials abatement at a higher level. Also, not to say that the city can't decide that that's something that needs to live in level 2, because we want to get rid of all the hazardous materials. We don't want a floor tile that starts coming up that we have to deal with in the future. I would say that all of this is very loose because of the stage we're at. I wouldn't even consider this pre-design. This is an exploration level cost estimate, and things can move between the different levels. It can be kind of fluid. This is a starting place. And as Bruce mentioned at the beginning, these values might go up or down based on what you have to say about what your priorities are. Similarly, we've got an extra $250,000, $300,000 between a tenant improvement project, which is going to get you a nice facility, and the level 4, which is a model community center. Model community center can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. We threw in some nice upgrades that we thought would be valuable. But say increasing the sound system in the gymnasium, you can spend $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 to make a really, really nice sound system if you want. We tried to have kind of a balance of, okay, this would take it to the next level, but this isn't a theater concert hall. It's a gymnasium type structure that's going to be used for community events. So level 4 could get way more expensive if you've got the money and you really have a dream, and we'd love to help you realize that. Level 3 could get less expensive because a lot of stuff went into level 2, like a seismic retrofit, roof replacements, fire sprinklers, and asbestos abatement. This is just to get us started, to get you guys asking these questions and thinking through the process and really understanding what the different scopes of work are. So I really appreciate these questions about why is this here? Why is that there? Because we have answers, but those answers can change depending upon the city's input.
Have you determined that the ceilings in the classroom are asbestos? Has that been looked at?
No, we haven't determined that. I mean, just from my own experience, it would probably be the mastic that was holding on the tiles. Those ceiling tiles are pretty common, but it's normally the glue that's holding them on, and it's just hard to say from looking at it from our visual observations.
Okay, thank you.
And these are kind of next level questions. If we make a decision to move forward, then those are the things we're going to have to know.
Yep.
Okay.
So you don't, you said you hadn't really gone in and done any structural examination in terms of actually digging in and finding out. You don't know if there's a lot of dry rot or termite problems or anything like that?
No, we didn't do destructive demolition.
I can speak to that though. While we didn't do destructive demolition, we see a lot of buildings with some dry rot here or there. Most of the time we'd take care of that at the time of a roof replacement because you have to do those things from above typically. What I saw in Cannon Beach Elementary isn't terribly different than what I've seen in other buildings. I would say there's probably some dry rot. We're probably going to have to pull up some decking and maybe replace some roof structure, but I don't think we're talking about expanses of the roof. And those kinds of numbers would be built into our seismic retrofit valuation because that's probably when we'd be doing that kind of work.
And I take that back. I did notice some dry rot on the exterior canopy on that breezeway. There was places definitely that you could hook up with your finger through the decking.
Clarify for me Brian's involvement. Was it just you were referred by O'Brien? Were they working with you? Were they involved in the inspection?
O'Brien did an inspection on their own with city staff, walked through the building, realized that they needed a little bit more expertise when it came to the engineering and architecture components of the project, and they referred us to the city. We've had conversations ongoing with O'Brien about level of effort and general costs, but as far as formal involvement in this component of the process, there wasn't a big portion of it.
Staff started with O'Brien.
Right, okay, that clarifies it.
Let me just jump back to the ADA questions. One that really confuses me cost-wise is 25% of the project.
Mm-hmm.
If you were doing a project and just did absolutely everything you possibly could to improve the ADA, but you're still way under the 25%, you still have to figure out more stuff?
No, it's 25%, or until the building is fully compliant.
Okay.
And that you take out some items from that 25%. So seismic retrofits do not count towards that 25%. Fire and life safety upgrades don't count. So sprinklers, seismic retrofit, you can take that all out and then take your 25%. There's some minor issues at the building. Luckily, everything's relatively flat, so there's not, a major ramp or grade changes. So doing the parking is not a big deal, providing a parking spot. Accessible restrooms is probably the biggest thing, because none of the restrooms in there met ADA. So, but once you do the
I'd like to
restroom,
add to that. Go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, no, I was just saying, once you do those, that's the majority of the accessibility improvements.
That's why you'll notice that level 3 does not include that 25%. That was an intentional removal in between level 2 and level 3. We figured that the ADA upgrades in level 2 are going to get us to a point where we're pretty much compliant in level 3, and we don't have to spend that 25% of the project cost at that level anymore.
Right.
Not at 3 or 4.
Thanks.
The other one I wanted to ask Matt, back to the breezeway canopy.
Mhm.
I know that's not connected to the building very well. Would improvements on that structure help, whether dramatically or minorly, with the seismic diaphragm?
I'll let Zach answer that.
Okay.
Yes. When we do a roof replacement and when we do a seismic retrofit, what we'd actually probably do is end up disconnecting the canopy, the breezeway in between the two buildings from the gymnasium, because we want the two buildings that are different shapes, different sizes, different heights, and different masses to be able to move differently because they're going to during an earthquake. So what we'd most likely end up with is a waterproofed seismic gap that's 3 to 6 inches wide in between that canopy and the roof. We may have to come in there and add a small portion of wall just to support that open edge of the canopy that used to be supported by the gym. Maybe it's a post and beam system. There's a lot of options with respect to how we can do that, but you're right, we will need to do something, and it will ultimately need to be strengthened if you move forward with the seismic retrofit. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that helps. In conjunction with that roof working aspect, the putting the firewall upgrade on the east end of the classrooms, does that have to shoot up higher than the roof? That was my understanding in the past.
Yeah, it depends on if it's a firewall versus a fire barrier. There's different requirements. Firewalls, yes, they have to extend up about 30 inches. Alternatively, you can go horizontally. So on that breezeway canopy, you could extend out fire protection 4 feet horizontally from that in this case. You don't have to shoot the wall past.
Yeah, and that wouldn't break then the roof pattern.
Right.
Okay. Interesting.
Would the project cost any less if the mezzanine was removed instead of rebuilt?
Yes, it would.
Any idea how much less?
I would have to look at, I think we put the mezzanine demo and remodel kind of together in the same line item. I mean, most of that line item is for remodeling it and not just demoing it. But if you are going to demo it, that kind of inherently involves rebuilding everything below it. So
that line item in particular includes new restrooms. It includes maybe a catering kitchen. We had to use square footage costs really to develop this because we don't have hard design documents to go off of. And this is a really good example. So the demolition of the mezzanine includes the demolition of everything below it. Everything below it's not in great shape right now. And for the gymnasium to function the way that we understand the city likely wants it to function, all that's going to need to be rebuilt. We're going to need some ADA restrooms. We're going to need probably a catering kitchen. We might need some storage space and janitorial space. Maybe there's an office in there or a ticket booth. Things like that. We had to make some assumptions, but whether or not we put a mezzanine on top of the new stuff that's where the mezzanine is presently isn't going to have a huge effect on the cost of the improvements.
One of the issues is that there's, I said at least 5, but level changes. Like when you first step into that area, there's a level change. The next office has a level change. I think the next one does. You got stairs going up, then you got stairs going to another level. So it's going to be difficult as is on an accessibility standpoint. And then also, I don't know how easy it would be to convert those relatively low ceilings to things like the restrooms and, potentially catering kitchen. And, if we're going to be using it somehow, we've got to have a place for tables and chairs and all those things that, could work easily. So I think as we get into it and we start doing, how we're going to use it, what design does that imply? I think that'll start to make a difference. But because of the level change, in my mind, it's kind of hard to continue to use it.
Seems like it'll be a utility area, not a public area.
Mhm.
Yeah, and with the kitchen and the restrooms, I guess.
In the mezzanine.
Yeah, but, yeah,
Might be nothing but storage, who knows?
I think a lot of that, like Bruce is saying, a lot of that discussion is going to happen in the design discussion. Once, we get public input, we start realizing the different possibilities, whether the use of the spaces are going to fit those possibilities. We'll get there. I'm buoyed quite a bit about the idea that the level 2 actually gets us into a somewhat a usable space to where we can have a sense of what we want to do with it by actually using it a little bit. So, and then there are clearly some construction parts of level 3 that make level 2 demesh. Really importantly, I think. And again, we still have to have that major discussion about the classrooms.
About what?
The classrooms.
Whether we're gonna use them or not.
Yeah, keep them or not. And I think that's that decision needs to start getting the design elements, what the value is compared to the values of not having it, stuff like that. I had one other question about the occupancy. The dialogue that you had in the report is fairly clear. Trying to describe how the occupancy is relevant to the building all being under one roof. I was curious if we just took away the roof between the two buildings, declared them both two separate buildings. Would that change any of the occupancy categorization?
If you made them two separate buildings, I mean, it doesn't really matter what the occupancies are. You can have two different occupancies. The problem is probably the proximity of the buildings. So you're still having to have that fire barrier separating them. I mean, there's the alternative to that fire barrier is sprinklering the whole thing.
Right.
And then it kind of creates one building and you don't have to worry about separation.
Okay, I'm just curious. Thanks. Another question. If we sprinkle the gym, which sounds like it's going to be eventually, it doesn't have to happen initially, but eventually. Structurally, how would that actually work on that big of an empty space? You just sprinkles way up at the top and it rains on everything, or?
I mean, I'm assuming they would hang them down, kind of like pendants, so they'd hang down the pipes, so they wouldn't be at the very top. They would probably be suspended somewhat. I don't know, Zach, do you have a better idea of how they would install sprinklers in there?
Yes and no. I'm not a sprinkler guy, but I work on a lot of projects with sprinklers. And what I can tell you is it's not uncommon for us to sprinkle gymnasiums. So install sprinklers up above the 20, 22 feet level that we need for basketball and volleyball height clearances. So we're used to seeing sprinklers 20 plus feet up in the air. I don't know if they're different sprinklers than the ones that we would have down low. I know that they account for the building volume in their sprinkler calculations. But that'll all come at kind of later date as we get into design and you decide what you're doing. But we wouldn't see sprinklers down at the 8-foot line. We could still have a nice big open space with sprinklers up high.
The building does have a structural piping thing up there. I don't know if that was for the heating or for whatever it was.
I think it's a natural gas line.
Yeah, it's just an old anecdote. When we used to play volleyball in there, that was part of the rules is if you hit the pipes, it's legal, So I'm thinking about that with sprinklers.
Yeah.
So,
I like that.
House rules.
Did you know they were live gas lines?
no, actually, they used to hang stuff from those. And,
Oh, gee.
I didn't know they were gas. Okay, any questions? I don't want to. Only one.
Thank you.
Bruce, you want to move on?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you both guys and for all the work and your flexibility as we went through this. This was just to start the conversation. We might as well know what it would cost. And so we have that. We talked about levels. So I think that everybody is a little smarter than we were before we started. And we kind of have another meeting set up. I think it's the 12th.
Yep.
And that's when we can say, okay, now that we know this, how are we going to move forward? What decisions, how are we going to do those? So we can kind of keep it moving on. So I appreciate everybody's patience. I would like to just go to the last page, and this will just take a short time. That's the one that's got the cost information. And because the number is a relatively scary number when you first see it, I just wanted to talk about, sometimes, the city talks about, pay as you go. And I made the assumption that 4 million would be the number. It'll change depending on what the total is. But
Bruce, I'm sorry to interrupt, just so that I'm on the same page. Are you referring to his model contribution?
yes,
Okay, thank you very much.
yeah. But anyway, we looked at the pay as you go. That will depend on how much money we have. And that might be if we were to do a phasing of a project. Maybe we wait until we have one, over $1 million. Maybe that'll take 3 years. So there's ways to go ahead and deal with it if it's a pay as you go. Right now, the loan rates are very good. So a 20-year loan, that would be $267,000 a year. We've never, over the past 5 years, we've always received at least $325,000. This year, before we hit the COVID, we were projecting $440,000 in revenue. And I'm not saying we need to go with a number that high, but even if we use the 325 for what we've had for at least 5 years, this is still underneath that number. And if we go for the 30-year, it's 200. So the only point there is that I don't think we need to be afraid of going with a better project. There are ways to get there as opposed to just saying we've got to, take that money out of something right now if we want to do any of this. So there are other options. So and this also does make an assumption, and it's not set in stone by any means. That is, these examples include the funding that would come from TLT. There are other ways to do the project. The reason I kind of focused on these is that we paid for the building out of those funds. And we kind of talked about that as being the source, but there are other ways to get to that point. So this is not an argument for using those. It's just, that's what we've talked about. That's how we could do this if we wanted to continue in that vein. There are other options, there's grants, there's other things we could do. So that's really it, is that it's not all gloom and doom, because when I saw that number, I went, So, okay, thank you.
Using those funds really enables us to make these choices,
Yes,
make the best one. We have some options now.
and again, we could actually do the whole, the highest level one, and then still potentially have money. And I always want to be careful, but potentially we would still have money to fund operations.
After debt service
Yes.
and still.
And we would not, depending on how much that is, we might have to go to general fund for other expenses. But until we hit that point, if we were to, again, go with the loan, there's no money that we have to pull out or any programs we have to stop to trade for this particular project.
As long as.
Right, as long as, now, but one thing I do want to say, in fairness and in transparency, is that those funds could be used for other things. So we're not taking anything that it exists, but we're trading opportunities. And so that's always something we got to consider when we're looking at this.
And I think also when we start hearing more on the community's willingness to use the building and how they want to use the building, and making that balance between community use and visitor use, so that we have legitimacy for the TLP.
Yeah,
That's a question that will help us with the funding aspect of it.
Yeah, I think, part of what I'm thinking and having been involved with these kind of things, it almost seems like there'll be a day use that would be involved from the hotel side if they were going to use it. And then also, and again, we would have 4 rooms plus a gym, but there would also be some day use for community functions. But then evening, there's pretty much it would be for community. So anyway, so I think that it's possible to strike that balance. But again, it's something that we've got to hear everybody. And
Yeah, on Tuesday, everybody is.
yeah.
How much do you see?
Yeah. And one of the things you'll see when we talk about process is there's a big public process at the very beginning before we really do. That's step 3. This is step 1. Step 2 is that we're going to talk about process. 3 is we do the process. So we're very close to starting that public process, and nothing moves until you all have enough information to make your decisions. And then from there, we can kind of move on. But there's going to be a lot of back and forth, ideas, proposals, funding, at cost estimates, all that stuff going back and forth until we can sort it out. Okay?
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Zach.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Zach, feel better, bud.
Thank you for having us, and I appreciate your patience with me stepping away to blow my nose and all,
Yeah.
all the things that come along with not being there.
Yeah.
Have a wonderful
There he
night.
goes. All right, thank you.
Bye.
Okay, anything for good of the order?
I do. I have funny. What can you say? You asked us to pursue a grant, or we said we would pursue a grant for Warren Way and Hemlock. And we didn't have high hopes. Don't know where it is on everybody's priority list, but.
It's still high, I think.
Huh?
It's high on my,
Okay, good, because we got a grant.
Yeah.
oh, great.
Where I've got a little bit of angst with it is that we're also going through the TSP process. And before we bring it to you folks at a workshop and all that, I want to try to get more information from the people we're working with on TSP, that if this project is funded, does that put us on a lower list of something else that we might want to pursue? So we wanted to get that information before we brought you the design and the idea that we got this project. Now, the project estimate, Karen, that was 138,000. Yeah, and this is for 100,000. So it requires some, additional funding either from road fund or something like that. But it's like the timing, it's like, let's make sure we don't shoot ourselves in the foot on this. So we'll be kind of going through that process and talking to you in December.
Does the grant require a timeline?
We're checking into that. And if it does, we have a lot of meetings coming up. We can bring it to you at any time. So, yeah, fortunately, we're lucky in that way. We're meeting blessed. And Jen, was there another question that we had on?
I think that was it. Was the
Okay.
update.
Okay.
Grant.
Yeah, okay. Anyway,
The transportation study could actually help us with the design of that intersection, or are you looking at it being in conflict with that?
what my concern is that suppose somebody's got a magic bullet for the issues we have downtown. And, but we can't get a grant for that because we took this grant before. So I just want to see, because, and it may have nothing to do with it. Every time you start going for a grant, you might start with a fresh page. But we just want to check on that.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it, Matt. But anyway, but we do have this in hand. And then there will be additional consideration for the dollars.
Okay.
Okay,
May I ask, how much was the grant for?
100,000.
Okay, I'm sorry if you said that, I didn't hear it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And the project was estimated at 138.
Okay. That sounds very good.
Okay. Karen, anything else we want to say?
No, we have a preliminary design based on what you'd asked us to come back with on a four-way stop
Mhm.
and the extension of the landscape. And so that's what our application was based on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Good of the order?
I just want to say thank you to the folks, primarily, I think Jen and Karen right now and Jeff, because we're getting grants like since I've been here, we haven't gotten. So we're doing pretty good.
Okay, she's doing the paperwork.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jen's got the relationships
She's
too.
working on one right now, look.
Yeah, what she's looking for, she's going for a grant for a bigger monitor. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and we are adjourned. Thank you.
Until, and